Hey guys and girls, and welcome back to episode 9 in this series where we are building a GraphQL API in Elixir with Phoenix. So what we want to do in this episode is actually build on our JWT functionality that we implemented in the last episode and be able to identify a user whenever a request comes in. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. So if we look at the mutation that we implemented in the last episode, we implemented the login user mutation, which returns a valid JWT token whenever a user logs in with an email and a password. So if we take a look at our server, just going to reload this for now. When we run the mutation login user with an email and a password, we get back a token. And in that token is the user ID. So that is like this unique identifier that we can use whenever a user sends a request to our application. So what you typically do when working with some sort of front end, which can be a web app or a mobile app, we will send this token in every request that a user is going to make. And in GraphQL, you can add a header. And by convention, the authorization header you call authorization. And then in the value, you'll say bearer, and then the token that was given by the server. So what happens now is that with every request that a user is going to make, we add this header to the HTTP request. So that is actually going to be a great way to identify the user and see who it is in our database. But at the moment, we don't have a way to actually intercept this header that we just provided with the JWT token and see if that user exists in our API. So what we need to do is implement a little bit of code that whenever a user makes a request to our API, that little bit of code is going to intercept the connection. It's going to look at the headers that we defined here. It's going to look at a token that we provided, and it's going to see if the user exists in our database. And then we can say that it's either true or false. So we have a user or we don't have a user. And what we want to do next is get more data of the user into our connection. Because at the moment, if we look at what we did in the last episode, what we implemented in our connection is just the user ID, which we implemented in the Guardian module. So the only thing that is provided into the JWT token that gets sent with every request is a user ID. But that's great. But for all the mutations that we're going to run, we need more than a user ID. We need to look at the role. We need to see if the user is able to run this mutation or run this query based on a role. So that's what we're going to do in this episode. So Phoenix provides a really easy way to implement this, and it's called a plug. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our GraphQL API web folder. And in here, we're going to make a new folder, and we are going to call it plugs, because you might implement multiple ones. And then in this plug folder, we will add a file and we will say context. And this is going to make sense in a second. So the way you define a plug in Phoenix is by, of course, making a dev module. And we are going to call it medium GraphQL API web, because that's what it is in. And then we're going to say plugs dot context, because that is the file name. That will do. And to implement the behavior of a plug, we're going to say behavior plug, and we are going to import plug.connection. And every plug has a basic setup, which is going to be, we first need a function called init. So dev init, which is going to take the options, and because we can do it in one line, we can say do and return the options. And the next function in the plug is always going to be the call function. So below that, we say def call. And the call function is going to take in the connection and the options, but we don't care about that. So we can just underscore that and then do and end it. So what we want to do in here is whenever a connection gets in our API, we want to intercept that authorization header and look if a user exists in our database. If it does exist in our database, we want to add the whole user model to the connection so that we can easily work with it in our application. So what we want to do is we actually want to make a context which is going to be a function that we're going to define, which is build context. And it takes in the connection. And if it's still not really clear what is going to happen in here, please bear with me. It's going to make sense in a second. So we're going to pipe our connection into the build context function, and whatever happens in the build context function is going to be returned as the context. And then at the end of the call function, we want to say absinthe.plug. And we want to add to our connection, put options. And in the options, we're going to say, okay, we're going to have the connection and we want to add the context as the context. So we get in a connection, we're going to build the context based on the connection, and we are going to return the connection, but we're going to add something on it. We're going to add a context as context. So under here, we're going to define a private function called build context, because that's what we defined up there, which is going to take in the connection. And then we need to do something with it. So out of the connection that we got into this function, we want to get the header, because the header is something we specified in the header of our request, and we want to extract it out of our connection and do something with it. So the plug library provides us with a function called get underscore request header. Not sure why it's not auto-completing, but that's fine for now. Which takes in the connection and then what we want to get out of the connection. And if we look at our GraphQL API, the header name is what we want to get out of it. So that's authorization. So we can copy that and we need to provide it as a string, which is going to be authorization. Okay, so now this function extracts what is in the connections with the header authorization. So we can pattern match that and we can say, okay, we want to get the token out of the authorization header and we want to put it into a variable. And we know that the data structure that our authorization header has is a string, and it has a name called bearer, then there is a space, and then we can say okay, and all the rest that's in there we want to assign to the variable token. So whenever this function runs, get request headers, we're gonna take in the connection, we're gonna extract the header authorization, which is gonna look pretty much like this. It's going to be a list in the string with a space, and then whatever comes after that we are going to assign to the token variable. So now we can work with the token variable and we can say, okay, with a connection with the authorization header and a string with a token, what we want to do next is decode that token. So we can say medium GraphQL GraphQL API dot guardian dot resource from claims, and we're gonna pass in the token, and we're gonna say do. No, do. What? Do, and I want to hit enter. End. So if we look at this, whenever we go into the build context function, we're first going to see, okay, out of the request headers, we're going to grab the authorization header key. We're going to see if it matches this pattern, which is a list with a string where there is a bearer, and then we're going to assign the rest of the string to token. After that, we're going to say medium GraphQL API guardian. We want to decode that token, so we're going to pass in the token to the resource from claims. And if you look at our guardian module, we can see that there's a resource from claims in this module, which takes in the claims. We're going to look up that user in our database with the ID that we provided and return it. So we're going to get a tuple back with OK in user. So in here, we now have access to the whole user object. So now we can actually pattern match on whatever returns from this function, and we know that it's going to be a tuple with an OK and a user. So we can say, oh, where is the, yeah, there we go. We can say if it returns an OK with a user, we want to return the user, because that is what we're going to put into our context. Because the build context function is going to return something, and what it returns is going to be the context, which is going to be put into our context. And if it doesn't match, we will say else. Whenever there is something that we try to match that doesn't represent the structure above, we will say, okay, we are gonna return just an empty list. So what happens now is that if there is a connection that comes into our API, we look at the connection, we try to build a context on the connection, we take a look if there is a header called authorization. If there is a header called authorization, we will extract the token from that header. We will look up that token in the function called resource and claims. Our resource and claims function gets into our database and tries to look up the user based on the ID from the sub. It's going to return an OK user. We're going to pattern match on the OK user, and we're going to return the user from this function. So whatever gets returned from the build context function is a user, and then we're going to put into the connection on the context key the user model. And I think I made a little mistake here, because what we actually want to return is not a user, but we want to put it in a map. And we can give it a name, and we're going to give it the name current user with the value that is going to be the user. Okay, and I see that I forgot something here, because the resource from claims doesn't take in the token, but it takes in the claims. So we need to get the claims, and we can do that by another function from Guardian, which is medium GraphQL API dot Guardian dot verify decode and verify, which takes in the token. It's gonna decode the token and verify it, and then we forgot a comma here. There we go. So the decode and verify function is going to decode the token and get the claims out of it. The claims are going to get put into the resource from claims that is going to run our function that gets the user back. and we return the user. Okay, so now we have finished this plug and we can plug it in to our router file. So in here, every request under the scope API pipes through this API pipeline, and we can just chain on another plug. And in our case, it's going to be the medium GraphQL API dot what do you call it? Dot plug dot context, I think. Let's save it and check it. API web dot plugs dot context. Okay, and let's just copy that and paste it in here. So now every request that hits our API is going to run through these plugs. So it's going to run through the context plug. All right, so that looks good. And then the last thing that I want to do, and you might have noticed that we jumped a bit in time, is we want to fix some things in our Guardian file. Because if I run my server now, mix phoenix.server, we should get a warning. Yeah. We get two warnings that this clause cannot match because a previous clause at line 5 always matches. So if we take a look at our Guardian module, what we have at the moment is we are binding, or the argument user is what we are using in our function, but this can be pretty much anything. So we want a pattern match on it. So what we can do, and I already have it down there, but I'm gonna type it in. We can pattern match on the user struct accounts.user is user. So now it will only run this function if the argument that we provide matches this pattern. And we can put this on one line. So we can say, okay, return toString the user ID, so we can remove this, so that's a lot cleaner. And let's get rid of that and save that. And then I want to redo this resource from claims, the other one that is always matching. So in here we want to pattern match this argument. So we know that when we get a decoded token back, a decoded token is just a map, and we want to get the sub out of the map, and we can pattern match that on the ID. So we can say, okay, whenever we run this function, we only want to run it if the argument is a map with a key on there with sub, and then we grab the ID. Okay, and then in here we don't need this anymore. But we can just say, okay, we'll make a case statement. We'll get the user and provided the ID that we pattern matched up here, ID. Then we'll do, and let's get rid of that. And then we can say, okay, if we don't have a user, so if the accounts.getUser returns a nil, we return a tuple with error. And the resource not found atom. And if we do have a user, so anything else, we'll just say, okay, return the user. All right, so this should work now. And we shouldn't get the warning that the clauses always match. So if we run our server again, we can see that it is now fixed. Awesome. Okay. So our Guardian module looks fine. Let's save it. We get the context now. We put it in the connection. So we can test it now by going into our schema and checking. Let's go to get a list of all users, the user resolver. So if you take a look at the resolver here, it has 3 arguments. The second argument is always going to be the input, and the last one is actually the context that we just defined, or we can, well, it's actually the connection, but we can grab the context out of it. So we can, for now, just take a look at the context and see if we get the user in the context. I had the server running already. Okay, so let's go to our API. Let's first grab a token. So let's run the mutation. I'm gonna move my mic a bit because I can't see stuff. Login user, which takes in the input, which is a map with an email, bob@bob.com, and a password, which is password. And we want to get back the user. Am I missing something? Oh. Curly braces. I want to get the user back, and we want to grab the ID, the email, the first name, and the last name. And we want to grab the token. Okay, so let's run this. That's working, so we now have the token. And now we need a way to send this token to our database. So we'll add a header called authorization, and then bearer with the value of the token. And now if we request data, so if we remove this and we have one mutation, one query that is called users, which gets all the users. IMD, email, first name and last name. If we run this, we can take a look at what the context is. So let's run it and let's take a look in our terminal. We can see that this context is this map, and in there we should see, yeah, there's the user. So we have the email, the ID, all the data that was in our database. So now we have a way to actually look at the connection that gets into our resolver and get the user out of it. Okay, so let's commit everything into our branch. Let's clear that and make the terminal a little bit bigger. There we go. And we forgot to initialize a new branch, so we can still do that, right? So git flow feature starts, and we'll call it add user to context. There we go. And if we go in here, and let's stage this, add user to context in plug, then add plug to router, then let's say implement token encoding and decoding with Guardian. Let's test this and say test context. All right, so everything is committed now. Git You don't have to do this, but I just like being a little bit consistent. And let's push this to GitHub. Okay. There we go. So that's it for now. What we'll do in the next one is we can actually implement some functionality so that we can protect our resolvers and check if there is a user in the context. And if there's a user in the context, we know that the user is logged in. And we can take a look at the role and see if that user is allowed to run that query or mutation. So that's like the authorization part of it. We'll write some middleware and we'll plug it into our GraphQL API. And we'll do that in the next one. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode.